Rev. My dear friend, in regard to that convict's letter there can be no doubt as to its genuineness. Williams, to whom it was written, lay in our jail and professed to have been converted, and Rev. Mr. the chaplain had great faith in the genuineness of the change, as much as one can have in any such case. The letter was sent to one of our ladies, who is a Sunday school teacher, sent either by Williams himself or the chaplain of the state's prison probably. She has been greatly annoyed in having so much publicity, lest it might seem a breach of confidence or be an injury to Williams. In regard to its publication, I can give no permission, though if the names and places were omitted, and especially if sent out of the country, I think you might take the responsibility and do it. It is a wonderful letter, which no Christian genius, much less one unsanctified, could ever have written. As showing the work of grace in a human heart, and in a very degraded and wicked one, it proves its own origin and reproves our weak faith in its power to cope with any form of wickedness. Mr. Brown of St. Louis, someone said, was a Hartford man. Do all whom you send from Hartford serve their master as well? P.S. Williams is still in the state's prison, serving out a long sentence of 9 years, I think. He has been sick and threatened with consumption, but I have not inquired after him lately. This lady that I speak of corresponds with him, I presume, and will be quite sure to look after him. This letter arrived a few days after it was written, and up went Mr. Williams's stock again. Mr. Warner's low-down suspicion was laid in the cold, cold grave, where it apparently belonged. It was a suspicion based upon mere internal evidence anyway, and when you come to internal evidence, it's a big field and a game that two can play at. As witness this other internal evidence, discovered by the writer of the note above quoted, that it is a wonderful letter, which no Christian genius, much less one unsanctified, could ever have written. I had permission now to print, provided I suppressed names and places and sent my narrative out of the country. So I chose an Australian magazine for vehicle, as being far enough out of the country, and set myself to work on my article. And the ministers set the pumps going again, with the letter to work the handles. But meantime Brother Page had been agitating. He had not visited the penitentiary, but he had sent a copy of the illustrious letter to the chaplain of that institution, and accompanied it with apparently inquiries. He got an answer, dated 4 days later than that other brother's reassuring epistle, and before my article was complete, it wandered into my hands. The original is before me now, and I here append it. It is pretty well loaded with internal evidence of the most solid description. State's Prison, Chaplain's Office, July 11, 1873. Dear Bro. Page, herewith please find the letter kindly loaned me. I am afraid its genuineness cannot be established. It purports to be addressed to some prisoner here. No such letter ever came to a prisoner here. All letters received are carefully read by officers of the prison before they go into the hands of the convicts, and any such letter could not be forgotten. Again, Charles Williams is not a Christian man, but a dissolute, cunning prodigal, whose father is a minister of the gospel. His name is an assumed one. I am glad to have made your acquaintance. I am preparing a lecture upon life seen through prison bars, and should like to deliver the same in your vicinity. And so ended that little drama. My poor article went into the fire, for whereas the materials for it were now more abundant and infinitely richer than they had previously been, there were parties all around me, who, although longing for the publication before, were a unit for suppression at this stage and complexion of the game. They said, "Wait, the wound is too fresh yet." All the copies of the famous letter except mine disappeared suddenly, and from that time onward, the aforetime same old drought set in the churches. As a rule, the town was on a spacious grin for a while, but there were places in it where the grin did not appear, and where it was dangerous to refer to the ex-convict's letter. A word of explanation. Jack Hunt, the professed writer of the letter, was an imaginary person. The burglar Williams, Harvard graduate, son of a minister, wrote the letter himself to himself, got it smuggled out of the prison, got it conveyed to persons who had supported and encouraged him in his conversion, where he knew 2 things would happen. The genuineness of the letter would not be doubted or inquired into, and the nub of it would be noticed and would have valuable effect, the effect, indeed, of starting a movement to get Mr. Williams pardoned out of prison. That nub is so ingeniously, so casually, flung in, and immediately left there in the tail of the letter undwelt upon, that an indifferent reader would never suspect that it was the heart and core of the epistle, if he even took note of it at all. This is the nub. I hope the warm weather is doing your lungs good. I was afraid when you was bleeding you would die. Give my respects, etc. That is all there is of it. Simply touch and go, no dwelling upon it. Nevertheless, it was intended for an eye that would be swift to see it, and it was meant to move a kind heart to try to effect the liberation of a poor reformed and purified fellow lying in the fell grip of consumption. When I for the first time heard that letter read 9 years ago, I felt that it was the most remarkable one I had ever encountered, and it so warmed me toward Mr. Brown of St. Louis that I said that if ever I visited that city again, I would seek out that excellent man and kiss the hem of his garment if it was a new one. Well, I visited St. Louis, but I did not hunt for Mr. Brown, for alas, the investigations of long ago had proved that the benevolent Brown, like Jack Hunt, was not a real person, but a sheer invention of that gifted rascal Williams, burglar, Harvard graduate, son of a clergyman. Chapter 53. My Boyhood's Home. We took passage in one of the fast boats of the St. Louis and St. Paul Packet Company, and started up the river. When I, as a boy, first saw the mouth of the Missouri River, it was 22 or 23 miles above St. Louis, according to the estimate of pilots. The wear and tear of the banks have moved it down 8 miles since then, and the pilots say that within 5 years the river will cut through and move the mouth down 5 miles more, which will bring it within 10 miles of St. Louis. About nightfall we passed the large and flourishing town of Alton, Illinois, and before daylight next morning the town of Louisiana, Missouri, a sleepy village in my day, but a brisk railway center now. However, all the towns out there are railway centers now. I could not clearly recognize the place. This seemed odd to me, for when I retired from the rebel army in '61, I retired upon Louisiana in good order, at least in good enough order for a person who had not yet learned how to retreat according to the rules of war, and had to trust to native genius. It seemed to me that for a first attempt at a retreat it was not badly done. I had done no advancing in all that campaign that was at all equal to it. There was a railway bridge across the river here well sprinkled with glowing lights, and a very beautiful sight it was. At 7 in the morning we reached Hannibal, Missouri, where my boyhood was spent. I had had a glimpse of it 15 years ago, and another glimpse 6 years earlier, but both were so brief that they hardly counted. The only notion of the town that remained in my mind was the memory of it as I had known it when I first quitted it 29 years ago. That picture of it was still as clear and vivid to me as a photograph. I stepped ashore with the feeling of one who returns out of a dead-and-gone generation. I had a sort of realizing sense of what the Bastille prisoners must have felt when they used to come out and look upon Paris after years of captivity, and note how curiously the familiar and the strange were mixed together before them. I saw the new houses, saw them plainly enough, but they did not affect the older picture in my mind, for through their solid bricks and mortar I saw the vanished houses, which had formerly stood there with perfect distinctness. It was Sunday morning, and everybody was abed yet. So I passed through the vacant streets, still seeing the town as it was and not as it is, and recognizing and metaphorically shaking hands with 100 familiar objects which no longer exist, and finally climbed Holliday's Hill to get a comprehensive view. The whole town lay spread out below me then, and I could mark and fix every locality, every detail. Naturally, I was a good deal moved. I said, many of the people I once knew in this tranquil refuge of my childhood are now in heaven. Some, I trust, are in the other place. The things about me and before me made me feel like a boy again, convinced me that I was a boy again, and that I had simply been dreaming an unusually long dream. But my reflections spoiled all that, for they forced me to say, I see 50 old houses down yonder, into each of which I could enter and find either a man or a woman who was a baby or unborn when I noticed those houses last, or a grandmother who was a plump young bride at that time. From this vantage ground the extensive view up and down the river, and wide over the wooded expanses of Illinois, is very beautiful, one of the most beautiful on the Mississippi, I think, which is a hazardous remark to make, for the 800 miles of river between St. Louis and St. Paul afford an unbroken succession of lovely pictures. It may be that my affection for the one in question biases my judgment in its favor. I cannot say as to that. No matter, it was satisfyingly beautiful to me, and it had this advantage over all the other friends whom I was about to greet again. It had suffered no change. It was as young and fresh and comely and gracious as ever it had been, whereas the faces of the others would be old and scarred with the campaigns of life, and marked with their griefs and defeats, and would give me no upliftings of spirit. An old gentleman, out on an early morning walk, came along, and we discussed the weather and then drifted into other matters. I could not remember his face. He said he had been living here 28 years, so he had come after my time and I had never seen him before. I asked him various questions, first about a mate of mine in Sunday school, what became of him. He graduated with honor in an Eastern college, wandered off into the world somewhere, succeeded at nothing, passed out of knowledge and memory years ago, and is supposed to have gone to the dogs. He was bright and promised well when he was a boy. Yes, but the thing that happened is what became of it all. I asked after another lad, altogether the brightest in our village school when I was a boy. He too was graduated with honors from an Eastern college, but life whipped him in every battle, straight along, and he died in one of the territories years ago, a defeated man. I asked after another of the bright boys. He is a success, always has been, always will be, I think. I inquired after a young fellow who came to the town to study for one of the professions when I was a boy. He went at something else before he got through, went from medicine to law or from law to medicine, then to some other new thing, went away for a year, came back with a young wife, fell to drinking, then to gambling behind the door, finally took his wife and 2 young children to her father's and went off to Mexico, went from bad to worse, and finally died there without a cent to buy a shroud, and without a friend to attend the funeral. Pity, for he was the best-natured, and most cheery and hopeful young fellow that ever was. I named another boy. Oh, he is all right, lives here yet, has a wife and children and is prospering. Same verdict concerning other boys. I named 3 schoolgirls. The first 2 live here are married and have children, the other is long ago dead, never married. I named with emotion one of my early sweethearts. She is all right, been married 3 times, buried 2 husbands, divorced from the 3rd, and I hear she's getting ready to marry an old fellow out in Colorado somewhere. She's got children scattered around here and there, most everywheres. The answer to several other inquiries was brief and simple. Killed in the war. I named another boy. Well, now his case is curious. There wasn't a human being in this town but knew that that boy was a perfect chucklehead, perfect dummy, just a stupid ass, as you may say. Everybody knew it and everybody said it. Well, if that very boy isn't the first lawyer in the state of Missouri today, I'm a Democrat. Is that so? It's actually so, I'm telling you the truth. How do you account for it? Account for it? There ain't any accounting for it except that if you send a damned fool to St. Louis, and you don't tell them he's a damned fool, they'll never find it out. There's one thing sure, if I had a damned fool I should know what to do with him. Ship him to St. Louis, it's the noblest market in the world for that kind of property. Well, when you come to look at it all around, and chew at it and think it over, don't it just bang anything you ever heard of? Well, yes, it does seem to. But don't you think maybe it was the Hannibal people who were mistaken about the boy, and not the St. Louis people? Oh, nonsense. The people here have known him from the very cradle. They knew him 100 times better than the St. Louis idiots could have known him. No, if you have got any damned fools that you want to realize on, take my advice, send them to St. Louis. I mentioned a great number of people whom I had formerly known. Some were dead, some were gone away, some had prospered, some had come to naught, but as regarded a dozen or so of the lot, the answer was comforting. Prosperous, live here yet, town littered with their children. I asked about Miss. Died in the insane asylum 3 or 4 years ago, never was out of it from the time she went in, and was always suffering too, never got a shred of her mind back. If he spoke the truth, here was a heavy tragedy indeed. 36 years in a madhouse that some young fools might have some fun. I was a small boy at the time, and I saw those giddy young ladies come tiptoeing into the room where Miss sat reading at midnight by a lamp. The girl at the head of the file wore a shroud and a dough face. She crept behind the victim, touched her on the shoulder, and she looked up and screamed and then fell into convulsions. She did not recover from the fright but went mad. In these days it seems incredible that people believed in ghosts so short a time ago, but they did. After asking after such other folk as I could call to mind, I finally inquired about myself. Oh, he succeeded well enough, another case of damned fool. If they'd sent him to St. Louis he'd have succeeded sooner. It was with much satisfaction that I recognized the wisdom of having told this candid gentleman, in the beginning, that my name was Smith. Chapter 54. Past and Present. Being left to myself up there, I went on picking out old houses in the distant town, and calling back their former inmates out of the mouldy past. Among them I presently recognized the house of the father of Lem Hackett, fictitious name. It carried me back more than a generation in a moment, and landed me in the midst of a time when the happenings of life were not the natural and logical results of great general laws, but of special orders, and were freighted with very precise and distinct purposes, partly punitive in intent, partly admonitory, and usually local in application. When I was a small boy, Lem Hackett was drowned on a Sunday. He fell out of an empty flatboat where he was playing. Being loaded with sin, he went to the bottom like an anvil. He was the only boy in the village who slept that night. We others all lay awake repenting. We had not needed the information delivered from the pulpit that evening that Lem's was a case of special judgment. We knew that already. There was a ferocious thunderstorm that night, and it raged continuously until near dawn. The winds blew, the windows rattled, the rain swept along the roof in pelting sheets, and at the briefest of intervals the inky blackness of the night vanished. The houses over the way glared out white and blinding for a quivering instant. Then the solid darkness shut down again, and a splitting peal of thunder followed, which seemed to rend everything in the neighborhood to shreds and splinters. I sat up in bed quaking and shuddering, waiting for the destruction of the world, and expecting it. To me, there was nothing strange or incongruous in heavens making such an uproar about Lem Hackett. Apparently it was the right and proper thing to do. Not a doubt entered my mind that all the angels were grouped together, discussing this boy's case and observing the awful bombardment of our beggarly little village with satisfaction and approval. There was one thing which disturbed me in the most serious way. That was the thought that this centering of the celestial interest on our village could not fail to attract the attention of the observers to people among us who might otherwise have escaped notice for years. I felt that I was not only one of those people, but the very one most likely to be discovered. That discovery could have but one result. I should be in the fire with Lem before the chill of the river had been fairly warmed out of him. I knew that this would be only just and fair. I was increasing the chances against myself all the time, by feeling a secret bitterness against Lem for having attracted this fatal attention to me, but I could not help it. This sinful thought persisted in infesting my breast in spite of me. Every time the lightning glared I caught my breath, and judged I was gone. In my terror and misery, I meanly began to suggest other boys, and mention acts of theirs which were wickeder than mine, and peculiarly needed punishment. And I tried to pretend to myself that I was simply doing this in a casual way, and without intent to divert the heavenly attention to them for the purpose of getting rid of it myself. With deep sagacity, I put these mentions into the form of sorrowing recollections and left-handed sham supplications that the sins of those boys might be allowed to pass unnoticed. Possibly they may repent. It is true that Jim Smith broke a window and lied about it, but maybe he did not mean any harm. And although Tom Holmes says more bad words than any other boy in the village, he probably intends to repent, though he has never said he would. And whilst it is a fact that John Jones did fish a little on Sunday, once he didn't really catch anything but only just one small useless mudcat, and maybe that wouldn't have been so awful if he had thrown it back, as he says he did, but he didn't. Pity but they would repent of these dreadful things, and maybe they will yet. But while I was shamefully trying to draw attention to these poor chaps, who were doubtless directing the celestial attention to me at the same moment, though I never once suspected that, I had heedlessly left my candle burning. It was not a time to neglect even trifling precautions. There was no occasion to add anything to the facilities for attracting notice to me, so I put the light out. It was a long night to me, and perhaps the most distressful one I ever spent. I endured agonies of remorse for sins which I knew I had committed, and for others which I was not certain about, yet was sure that they had been set down against me in a book by an angel who was wiser than I and did not trust such important matters to memory. It struck me by and by that I had been making a most foolish and calamitous mistake. In one respect, doubtless I had not only made my own destruction sure by directing attention to those other boys, but had already accomplished theirs. Doubtless the lightning had stretched them all dead in their beds by this time. The anguish and the fright which this thought gave me made my previous sufferings seem trifling by comparison. Things had become truly serious. I resolved to turn over a new leaf instantly. I also resolved to connect myself with the church the next day, if I survived to see its sun appear. I resolved to cease from sin in all its forms, and to lead a high and blameless life for ever after. I would be punctual at church and Sunday school, visit the sick, carry baskets of victuals to the poor, simply to fulfill the regulation conditions, although I knew we had none among us so poor but they would smash the basket over my head for my pains. I would instruct other boys in right ways and take the resulting trouncings meekly. I would subsist entirely on tracts. I would invade the rum shop and warn the drunkard. And finally, if I escaped the fate of those who early become too good to live, I would go for a missionary. The storm subsided toward daybreak, and I dozed gradually to sleep with a sense of obligation to Lem Hackett for going to eternal suffering in that abrupt way, and thus preventing a far more dreadful disaster, my own loss. But when I rose refreshed by and by, and found that those other boys were still alive, I had a dim sense that perhaps the whole thing was a false alarm, that the entire turmoil had been on Lem's account and nobody's else. The world looked so bright and safe that there did not seem to be any real occasion to turn over a new leaf. I was a little subdued during that day, and perhaps the next. After that, my purpose of reforming slowly dropped out of my mind, and I had a peaceful, comfortable time again until the next storm. That storm came about 3 weeks later, and it was the most unaccountable one to me that I had ever experienced, for on the afternoon of that day, Dutchy was drowned. Dutchy belonged to our Sunday school. He was a German lad who did not know enough to come in out of the rain, but he was exasperatingly good, and had a prodigious memory. One Sunday he made himself the envy of all the youth and the talk of all the admiring village, by reciting 3,000 verses of scripture without missing a word. Then he went off the very next day and got drowned. Circumstances gave to his death a peculiar impressiveness. We were all bathing in a muddy creek which had a deep hole in it, and in this hole the coopers had sunk a pile of green hickory hoop poles to soak, some 12 feet under water. We were diving and seeing who could stay under longest. We managed to remain down by holding on to the hoop poles. Dutchy made such a poor success of it that he was hailed with laughter and derision every time his head appeared above water. At last he seemed hurt with the taunts, and begged us to stand still on the bank and be fair with him, and give him an honest count, be friendly and kind just this once, and not miscount for the sake of having the fun of laughing at him. Treacherous winks were exchanged, and all said, "All right, Dutchy, go ahead, we'll play fair." Dutchy plunged in, but the boys, instead of beginning to count, followed the lead of one of their number and scampered to a range of blackberry bushes close by and hid behind it. They imagined Dutchy's humiliation, when he should rise after a superhuman effort, and find the place silent and vacant, nobody there to applaud. They were so full of laugh with the idea that they were continually exploding into muffled cackles. Time swept on, and presently one who was peeping through the briars said with surprise, "Why, he hasn't come up yet." The laughing stopped. "Boys, it's a splendid dive," said one. "Never mind that," said another, "the joke on him is all the better for it." There was a remark or two more and then a pause. Talking ceased and all began to peer through the vines. Before long the boys' faces began to look uneasy, then anxious, then terrified. Still there was no movement of the placid water. Hearts began to beat fast and faces to turn pale. We all glided out silently and stood on the bank, our horrified eyes wandering back and forth from each other's countenances to the water. Somebody must go down and see. Yes, that was plain, but nobody wanted that grisly task. Draw straws. So we did, with hands which shook so that we hardly knew what we were about. The lot fell to me and I went down. The water was so muddy I could not see anything, but I felt around among the hoop poles and presently grasped a limp wrist which gave me no response, and if it had I should not have known it, I let it go with such a frightened suddenness. The boy had been caught among the hoop poles and entangled there, helplessly. I fled to the surface and told the awful news. Some of us knew that if the boy were dragged out at once he might possibly be resuscitated, but we never thought of that. We did not think of anything. We did not know what to do, so we did nothing, except that the smaller lads cried piteously, and we all struggled frantically into our clothes, putting on any bodies that came handy, and getting them wrong side out and upside down as a rule. Then we scurried away and gave the alarm, but none of us went back to see the end of the tragedy. We had a more important thing to attend to. We all flew home, and lost not a moment in getting ready to lead a better life. The night presently closed down, then came on that tremendous and utterly unaccountable storm. I was perfectly dazed, I could not understand it. It seemed to me that there must be some mistake. The elements were turned loose, and they rattled and banged and blazed away in the most blind and frantic manner. All heart and hope went out of me, and the dismal thought kept floating through my brain, if a boy who knows 3,000 verses by heart is not satisfactory, what chance is there for anybody else? Of course I never questioned for a moment that the storm was on Dutchy's account, or that he or any other inconsequential animal was worthy of such a majestic demonstration from on high. The lesson of it was the only thing that troubled me, for it convinced me that if Dutchy, with all his perfections, was not a delight, it would be vain for me to turn over a new leaf, for I must infallibly fall hopelessly short of that boy, no matter how hard I might try. Nevertheless, I did turn it over. A highly educated fear compelled me to do that, but succeeding days of cheerfulness and sunshine came bothering around, and within a month I had so drifted backward that again I was as lost and comfortable as ever. Breakfast time approached while I mused these musings and called these ancient happenings back to mind, so I got me back into the present and went down the hill. On my way through town to the hotel, I saw the house which was my home when I was a boy. At present rates, the people who now occupy it are of no more value than I am, but in my time they would have been worth not less than $500 apiece. They are colored folk. After breakfast, I went out alone again, intending to hunt up some of the Sunday schools and see how this generation of pupils might compare with their progenitors who had sat with me in those places and had probably taken me as a model, though I do not remember as to that now. By the public square there had been in my day a shabby little brick church called the Old Ship of Zion, which I had attended as a Sunday school scholar, and I found the locality easily enough, but not the old church. It was gone, and a trig and rather hilarious new edifice was in its place. The pupils were better dressed and better looking than were those of my time. Consequently, they did not resemble their ancestors, and consequently there was nothing familiar to me in their faces. Still, I contemplated them with a deep interest and a yearning wistfulness, and if I had been a girl I would have cried, for they were the offspring and represented and occupied the places of boys and girls, some of whom I had loved to love, and some of whom I had loved to hate, but all of whom were dear to me for the one reason or the other, so many years gone by, and Lord, where be they now? I was mightily stirred, and would have been grateful to be allowed to remain unmolested and look my fill, but a bald-summited superintendent, who had been a tow-headed Sunday school mate of mine on that spot in the early ages, recognized me, and I talked a flutter of wild nonsense to those children to hide the thoughts which were in me, and which could not have been spoken without a betrayal of feeling that would have been recognized as out of character with me. Making speeches without preparation is no gift of mine, and I was resolved to shirk any new opportunity, but in the next and larger Sunday school I found myself in the rear of the assemblage, so I was very willing to go on the platform a moment for the sake of getting a good look at the scholars. On the spur of the moment, I could not recall any of the old idiotic talks which visitors used to insult me with when I was a pupil there, and I was sorry for this, since it would have given me time and excuse to dawdle there, and take a long and satisfying look at what I feel at liberty to say was an array of fresh young comeliness not matchable in another Sunday school of the same size. As I talked merely to get a chance to inspect, and as I strung out the random rubbish solely to prolong the inspection, I judged it but decent to confess these low motives, and I did so. If the model boy was in either of these Sunday schools, I did not see him. The model boy of my time, we never had, but the one was perfect. Perfect in manners, perfect in dress, perfect in conduct, perfect in filial piety, perfect in exterior godliness, but at bottom he was a prig. And as for the contents of his skull, they could have changed place with the contents of a pie, and nobody would have been the worse off for it but the pie. This fellow's reproachlessness was a standing reproach to every lad in the village. He was the admiration of all the mothers, and the detestation of all their sons. I was told what became of him, but as it was a disappointment to me, I will not enter into details. He succeeded in life. Chapter 55. A Vendetta and Other Things. During my 3 days' stay in the town, I woke up every morning with the impression that I was a boy, for in my dreams the faces were all young again, and looked as they had looked in the old times, but I went to bed 100 years old every night, for meantime I had been seeing those faces as they are now. Of course I suffered some surprises along at first, before I had become adjusted to the changed state of things. I met young ladies who did not seem to have changed at all, but they turned out to be the daughters of the young ladies I had in mind, sometimes their granddaughters. When you are told that a stranger of 50 is a grandmother, there is nothing surprising about it, but if, on the contrary, she is a person whom you knew as a little girl, it seems impossible. You say to yourself, how can a little girl be a grandmother? It takes some little time to accept and realize the fact that while you have been growing old, your friends have not been standing still in that matter. I noticed that the greatest changes observable were with the women, not the men. I saw men whom 30 years had changed but slightly, but their wives had grown old. These were good women. It is very wearing to be good. There was a saddler whom I wished to see, but he was gone. Dead these many years, they said. Once or twice a day the saddler used to go tearing down the street, putting on his coat as he went, and then everybody knew a steamboat was coming. Everybody knew also that John Stavely was not expecting anybody by the boat, or any freight either, and Stavely must have known that everybody knew this. Still it made no difference to him. He liked to seem to himself to be expecting 100,000 tons of saddles by this boat, and so he went on all his life, enjoying being faithfully on hand to receive and receipt for those saddles in case by any miracle they should come. A malicious Quincy paper used always to refer to this town, in derision, as Stavely's Landing. Stavely was one of my earliest admirations. I envied him his rush of imaginary business, and the display he was able to make of it before strangers, as he went flying down the street struggling with his fluttering coat. But there was a carpenter who was my chiefest hero. He was a mighty liar, but I did not know that. I believed everything he said. He was a romantic, sentimental, melodramatic fraud, and his bearing impressed me with awe. I vividly remember the first time he took me into his confidence. He was planing aboard, and every now and then he would pause and heave a deep sigh, and occasionally mutter broken sentences, confused and not intelligible, but out of their midst an ejaculation sometimes escaped which made me shiver and did me good. One was, "Oh God, it is his blood." I sat on the tool chest and humbly and shudderingly admired him, for I judged he was full of crime. At last he said in a low voice, "My little friend, can you keep a secret?" I eagerly said I could. "A dark and dreadful one." I satisfied him on that point. "Then I will tell you some passages in my history, for oh, I must relieve my burdened soul, or I shall die." He cautioned me once more to be as silent as the grave. Then he told me he was a red-handed murderer. He put down his plane, held his hands out before him, contemplated them sadly, and said, "Look, with these hands I have taken the lives of 30 human beings." The effect which this had upon me was an inspiration to him, and he turned himself loose upon his subject with interest and energy. He left generalizing and went into details, began with his first murder, described it, told what measures he had taken to avert suspicion, then passed to his second homicide, his third, his fourth, and so on. He had always done his murders with a Bowie knife, and he made all my hairs rise by suddenly snatching it out and showing it to me. At the end of this first séance I went home with 6 of his fearful secrets among my freightage, and found them a great help to my dreams, which had been sluggish for a while back. I sought him again and again on my Saturday holidays. In fact, I spent the summer with him, all of it which was valuable to me. His fascinations never diminished, for he threw something fresh and stirring in the way of horror into each successive murder. He always gave names, dates, places, everything. This by and by enabled me to note 2 things, that he had killed his victims in every quarter of the globe, and that these victims were always named Lynch. The destruction of the Lynches went serenely on, Saturday after Saturday, until the original 30 had multiplied to 60, and more to be heard from yet. Then my curiosity got the better of my timidity, and I asked how it happened that these justly punished persons all bore the same name. My hero said he had never divulged that dark secret to any living being, but felt that he could trust me, and therefore he would lay bare before me the story of his sad and blighted life. He had loved one too fair for earth, and she had reciprocated with all the sweet affection of her pure and noble nature. But he had a rival, a base hireling named Archibald Lynch, who said the girl should be his, or he would dye his hands in her heart's best blood. The carpenter, innocent and happy in love's young dream, gave no weight to the threat but led his golden-haired darling to the altar. And there the two were made one. There also, just as the minister's hands were stretched in blessing over their heads, the fell deed was done with a knife, and the bride fell a corpse at her husband's feet. And what did the husband do? He plucked forth that knife, and kneeling by the body of his lost one, swore to consecrate his life to the extermination of all the human scum that bear the hated name of Lynch. That was it. He had been hunting down the Lynches and slaughtering them from that day to this 20 years. He had always used that same consecrated knife. With it he had murdered his long array of Lynches, and with it he had left upon the forehead of each victim a peculiar mark, a cross deeply incised, said he. The cross of the mysterious avenger is known in Europe, in America, in China, in Siam, in the tropics, in the polar seas, in the deserts of Asia, in all the earth. Wherever in the uttermost parts of the globe a Lynch has penetrated, there has the mysterious cross been seen, and those who have seen it have shuddered and said, "It is his mark, he has been here." You have heard of the mysterious avenger, look upon him, for before you stands no less a person. But beware, breathe not a word to any soul, be silent and wait. Some morning this town will flock aghast to view a gory corpse, on its brow will be seen the awful sign, and men will tremble and whisper, "He has been here, it is the mysterious avenger's Mark. You will come here, but I shall have vanished, you will see me no more." This ass had been reading the Gibbernanas, no doubt, and had had his poor romantic head turned by it. But as I had not yet seen the book then, I took his inventions for truth, and did not suspect that he was a plagiarist. However, we had a Lynch living in the town, and the more I reflected upon his impending doom, the more I could not sleep. It seemed my plain duty to save him, and a still plainer and more important duty to get some sleep for myself, so at last I ventured to go to Mr. Lynch and tell him what was about to happen to him, under strict secrecy. I advised him to fly, and certainly expected him to do it. But he laughed at me, and he did not stop there. He led me down to the carpenter's shop, gave the carpenter a jeering and scornful lecture upon his silly pretensions, slapped his face, made him get down on his knees and beg, then went off and left me to contemplate the cheap and pitiful ruin of what in my eyes had so lately been a majestic and incomparable hero. The carpenter blustered, flourished his knife, and doomed this Lynch in his usual volcanic style, the size of his fateful words undiminished. But it was all wasted upon me. He was a hero to me no longer, but only a poor, foolish, exposed humbug. I was ashamed of him and ashamed of myself. I took no further interest in him and never went to his shop any more. He was a heavy loss to me, for he was the greatest hero I had ever known. The fellow must have had some talent, for some of his imaginary murders were so vividly and dramatically described that I remember all their details yet. The people of Hannibal are not more changed than is the town. It is no longer a village, it is a city with a mayor and a council and waterworks and probably a debt. It has 15,000 people, is a thriving and energetic place, and is paved like the rest of the West and South, where a well-paved street and a good sidewalk are things so seldom seen that one doubts them when he does see them. The customary half-dozen railways centre in Hannibal now, and there is a new depot which cost $100,000. In my time the town had no specialty and no commercial grandeur. The daily packet usually landed a passenger and bought a catfish, and took away another passenger and a hatful of freight. But now a huge commerce in lumber has grown up, and a large miscellaneous commerce is one of the results. A deal of money changes hands there now. Bear Creek, so called perhaps because it was always so particularly bare of bears, is hidden out of sight now, under islands and continents of piled lumber, and nobody but an expert can find it. I used to get drowned in it every summer regularly, and be drained out, and inflated and set going again by some chance enemy, but not enough of it is unoccupied now to drown a person in. It was a famous breeder of chills and fever in its day. I remember one summer when everybody in town had this disease at once. Many chimneys were shaken down, and all the houses were so racked that the town had to be rebuilt. The chasm or gorge between Lover's Leap and the hill west of it is supposed by scientists to have been caused by glacial action. This is a mistake. There is an interesting cave a mile or two below Hannibal, among the bluffs. I would have liked to revisit it, but had not time. In my time the person who then owned it turned it into a mausoleum for his daughter, aged 14. The body of this poor child was put into a copper cylinder filled with alcohol, and this was suspended in one of the dismal avenues of the cave. The top of the cylinder was removable, and it was said to be a common thing for the Baser order of tourists to drag the dead face into view and examine it and comment upon it. Chapter 56. A Question of Law. The slaughterhouse is gone from the mouth of Bear Creek, and so is the small jail or calaboose, which once stood in its neighborhood. A citizen asked, "Do you remember when Jimmy Finn, the town drunkard, was burned to death in the calaboose?" Observe now how history becomes defiled, through lapse of time and the help of the bad memories of men. Jimmy Finn was not burned in the calaboose, but died a natural death in a tan vat, of a combination of delirium tremens and spontaneous combustion. When I say natural death, I mean it was a natural death for Jimmy Finn to die. The calaboose victim was not a citizen, he was a poor stranger, a harmless whiskey-sodden tramp. I know more about his case than anybody else. I knew too much of it in that bygone day to relish speaking of it. That tramp was wandering about the streets one chilly evening, with a pipe in his mouth and begging for a match. He got neither matches nor courtesy. On the contrary, a troop of bad little boys followed him around and amused themselves with nagging and annoying him. I assisted, but at last some appeal which the wayfarer made for forbearance, accompanying it with a pathetic reference to his forlorn and friendless condition, touched such sense of shame and remnant of right feeling as were left in me. And I went away and got him some matches, and then hied me home and to bed, heavily weighted as to conscience, and unbuoyant in spirit. An hour or two afterward, the man was arrested and locked up in the calaboose by the marshal, large name for a constable, but that was his title. At 2 in the morning the church bells rang for fire, and everybody turned out, of course, I with the rest. The tramp had used his matches disastrously. He had set his straw bed on fire, and the oaken sheathing of the room had caught. When I reached the ground, 200 men, women and children stood massed together, transfixed with horror, and staring at the grated windows of the jail. Behind the iron bars, and tugging frantically at them and screaming for help, stood the tramp. He seemed like a black object set against a sun, so white and intense was the light at his back. That marshal could not be found, and he had the only key. A battering ram was quickly improvised, and the thunder of its blows upon the door had so encouraging a sound that the spectators broke into wild cheering, and believed the merciful battle won. But it was not so. The timbers were too strong, they did not yield. It was said that the man's death grip still held fast to the bars after he was dead, and that in this position the fires wrapped him about and consumed him. As to this, I do not know. What was seen after I recognized the face that was pleading through the bars was seen by others, not by me. I saw that face, so situated, every night for a long time afterward, and I believed myself as guilty of the man's death as if I had given him the matches purposely that he might burn himself up with them. I had not a doubt that I should be hanged if my connection with this tragedy were found out. The happenings and the impressions of that time are burnt into my memory, and the study of them entertains me as much now as they themselves distressed me then. If anybody spoke of that grisly matter, I was all ears in a moment, and alert to hear what might be said, for I was always dreading and expecting to find out that I was suspected. And so fine and so delicate was the perception of my guilty conscience, that it often detected suspicion in the most purposeless remarks, and, in looks, gestures, glances of the eye which had no significance, but which sent me shivering away in a panic of fright, just the same. And how sick it made me when somebody dropped, howsoever carelessly and barren of intent, the remark that murder will out. For a boy of 10 years I was carrying a pretty weighty cargo. All this time I was blessedly forgetting one thing, the fact that I was an inveterate talker in my sleep. But one night I awoke and found my bedmate, my younger brother, sitting up in bed and contemplating me by the light of the moon. I said, "What is the matter? You talk so much I can't sleep." I came to a sitting posture in an instant, with my kidneys in my throat and my hair on end. "What did I say? Quick, out with it, what did I say?" "Nothing much." "It's a lie, you know everything." "Everything about what?" "You know well enough about that." "About what? I don't know what you are talking about. I think you are sick or crazy or something, but anyway you're awake and I'll get to sleep while I've got a chance." He fell asleep and I lay there in a cold sweat, turning this new terror over in the whirling chaos which did duty as my mind. The burden of my thought was, how much did I divulge? How much does he know? What a distress is this uncertainty! But by and by I evolved an idea. I would wake my brother and probe him with a supposititious case. I shook him up and said, "Suppose a man should come to you drunk." "This is foolish, I never get drunk." "I don't mean you, idiot, I mean the man. Suppose a man should come to you drunk and borrow a knife or a tomahawk or a pistol, and you forgot to tell him it was loaded and—" "How could you load a tomahawk?" "I don't mean the tomahawk and I didn't say the tomahawk, I said the pistol. Now don't you keep breaking in that way because this is serious. There's been a man killed." "What, in this town?" "Yes, in this town." "Well, go on, I won't say a single word." "Well then, suppose you forgot to tell him to be careful with it, because it was loaded, and he went off and shot himself with that pistol, fooling with it, you know, and probably doing it by accident, being drunk. Well, would it be murder?" "No, suicide." No, I don't mean his act, I mean yours. Would you be a murderer for letting him have that pistol?" After deep thought came this answer. "Well, I should think I was guilty of something, maybe murder. Yes, probably murder, but I don't quite know." This made me very uncomfortable. However, it was not a decisive verdict. I should have to set out the real case, there seemed to be no other way, but I would do it cautiously and keep a watch out for suspicious effects. I said, "I was supposing a case, but I am coming to the real one now. Do you know how the man came to be burned up in the calaboose?" "No." Haven't you the least idea? Not the least. Wish you may die in your tracks if you have. Yes, wish I may die in my tracks. Well, the way of it was this. The man wanted some matches to light his pipe. A boy got him some. The man set fire to the calaboose with those very matches and burnt himself up. Is that so? Yes, it is. Now is that boy a murderer, do you think? Let me see, the man was drunk. Yes, he was drunk. Very drunk. Yes. And the boy knew it. Yes, he knew it. There was a long pause, then came this heavy verdict. If the man was drunk and the boy knew it, the boy murdered that man, this is certain. Faint, sickening sensations crept along all the fibers of my body, and I seemed to know how a person feels who hears his death sentence pronounced from the bench. I waited to hear what my brother would say next. I believed I knew what it would be, and I was right. He said, I know the boy. I had nothing to say, so I said nothing. I simply shuddered. Then he added, Yes, before you got half through telling about the thing, I knew perfectly well who the boy was. It was Ben Kuntz. I came out of my collapse as one who rises from the dead. I said with admiration, Why, how in the world did you ever guess it?